I think his state of mind and his physical state probably had an impact on the decision-making in the last weeks and months, which in turn, of course, aided the revolution in a major manner.
You then have essentially almost a civil war going on between the person who's been left behind as the Prime Minister, a chap called Bakhtiar by the Shah, and somebody who, and Ayatollah Khomeini says, well, I'm going to do the appointing, if anybody is, and he appoints a chap called Bazagan. And you then have a fairly serious civil war going on. The coup takes place. Initially, it's a failure, and the Shah himself actually says, I'm out of here, and actually departs. When the coup is successful on the second attempt, he comes back again. They also went round the Soviet embassy as well and tried to do the same. And the Soviet ambassador came out onto the veranda and said, in perfect Farsi, quite understand your revolutionary ambitions here, but you must understand, if you continue with this, in 1 hour's time, your country will cease to exist.
It's 1979, and the Middle East is about to change for good. The monarchy has ruled Iran for over 2,500 years, but the Pahlavi dynasty, in power since the 1920s, will be the country's last. Despite prior interventions from Britain and the United States to keep Mohammad Reza Shah in power, 1979 was the culmination of the revolution which saw Iran become an Islamic Republic led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Of course, it's still an event that has huge ramifications today. It altered culture, politics, economies, and the global relationship between East and West. But what if it had never come to pass? I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode, we focus on a different military campaign or a tide of history, and with the help of our experts, we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today, it's the Iranian Revolution of 1979, a seismic shock to geopolitics that continues to be felt around the globe. Yet what if the Shah had remained in power? Where would that leave a series of wars in the Middle East, the Cold War, 9/11, and even the relationship with the US right now? These are, of course, questions for our experts, and joining me today, as ever, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and for the first time on the channel, Dr. Siavush Randjbar-Daemi, Senior Lecturer in Modern Middle Eastern History at the University of St Andrews. Welcome to you both. Now, I have mentioned this before, but I've been producing this show for the last 2 years, and I'm thrilled to now say that I will be your new host moving forward. Darryl Morris, of course, left big shoes to fill, and I can't thank him enough for all his work, but it is a real honour to go from producer to host and step up. Right, let's get into today's episode. This should be a really fascinating one with kind of long-lasting consequences. We have in front of us a map of the Middle East as we see it today. Now, we'll be using this for the whole discussion today, just to show us kind of what the Middle East looks like now, how we got there, and obviously how things might have been different. Of course, you have Iran here. Now, Siavush, thank you so much for joining us on History Undone. It's a real pleasure to have you. One of my questions I really want to get across in this discussion today is that as we learn so much throughout history and on this show, the long arm of the British Empire is very much involved. We'll come back to that a little bit later. What is the relationship between Iran and the West before the revolution under the Shah?
Well, the relationship was a rather complex one. The West was heavily involved in Iran from the first decade of the 20th century. In 1908, oil is discovered in southern Iran. It is the first discovery of oil in the entire Middle East. And that is really the start of the process that leads us to today and the current energy crisis we are witnessing. That oil was discovered by British economic adventure. It rapidly went under British state control through the Anglo-Persian and then Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And from roughly 1912 to 1951, that was the era in which Iranian oil was under British control, and Britain had a very significant influence in Iran. The American influence in Iran really increases considerably, and to some extent takes over Britain after the August 1953 coup, which was a joint operation managed by the CIA and MI6 to overthrow Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh and restore the Shah to power. And from 1953 onwards, it is the United States that becomes the main Western influence, if you want, in Iran, coupled with increasing Anglophobia within even the establishment of the Shah. The Shah himself was a known Anglophobe and always thinking that Britain was behind every plot, any challenge to his rule. But he always had a very warm relationship with the States, which ironically was also the attitude of Mossadegh until the day prior to his overthrow. Iran progressively builds links with other Western countries. French influence, for example, was particularly strong after the marriage of the Shah with his last wife, Farah Diba, who is still alive. This leads us to the 60s and 70s in which consumerism took hold and really the Western influence expanded into the cultural and sort of economic realms as well.
So Siavush there has taken us kind of to the 60s and 70s, Chris. But if we go back slightly, because that relationship I discussed and kind of the environment for revolution, it kind of even goes back to the 19th century.
Absolutely, and of course what we've got to realise is that Iran becomes part of the great game between France, Britain, Russia, particularly in this part of Asia here. And what is indicative is what is to come is a thing called the tobacco protest in 1891. Now, what happens is the regime in Iran at the time gives a monopoly of the sale and export of tobacco to a major toll boat, a total monopoly. And this overturns the employment of nearly 200,000 people in Iran and creates great hardship. And there is a real backlash by the people and also by the religious authorities, and it overturns it. And in some ways, this foreshadows what's going to happen. Now, as we go forward, there's a constitutional, at the same time as things are happening in Russia and elsewhere around the world, you have a constitutional revolution between 1905 and 11, where the Shah starts to give some sort of authority to a majlis, a constitutional council, and that starts to develop. And of course, once you weaken, people obviously say, oh, there's opportunities here and things like that. But let's go forward a bit. And we find actually that, again, there's a regime change in 1921 and the Shahs that we're familiar with, his father is put in place.
His father is Reza Shah, and then we get Mohammad Reza Shah.
It's very confusing. But it's the same in British history, of course. You know, we get William I, William II. So you've got a situation where he's in power. He actually starts to bring forward quite a lot of reforms himself. He's almost the Ataturk of Iran at this stage. He's saying, look, we need more secularization, we need modernization, and we get more westernization started. Now, again, we have to come forward to 1941, where Iran becomes, again, yet a pawn in the game between the powers that are in the Second World War. And Russia and Britain between them say, hey, we can't afford to let the oil that is in Iran get into the hands of the Axis powers, or indeed, you know, obviously, we're going to be held to ransom. And you get an occupation that is based on basically toppling Reza Shah and replacing him with his young son.
And do they use a guy, like a bit of a guise here, Siavush? Do they sort of suggest that the Shah might be close with Hitler in 1941?
Yes. I mean, one of the reasons for this invasion was concern over control over the oil industry, which I mentioned had really expanded considerably by 1941. The other was, of course, there were plenty of German engineers. Reza Shah was very keen on developing Iranian infrastructure, which pretty much didn't exist when he took power, railroads and civil infrastructure and more. And much of this was actually built by German engineers in the 30s and 40s. The number of German engineers was not large, but it was enough to form a casus belli, if you want, and coupled with the German offensive, which was still going on in the Soviet Union at the time, it gave enough rationale, at least within the Allied powers, to go for this joint invasion. And of course, the Iranian army, which had standing army, which had been developed by Reza Shah since the 1920s, was no match for a cooperation by Britain and the Soviet Union from both the north and the south of the country. So that conflict came to an end very quickly, and Iran entered into the spirit of Allied occupation, which persisted until 1946.
Can we move forward to 1953 then, in that, Chris? Because we just said there of 1941, the British interest with oil, does that kind of directly lead to 53, this operation by the CIA and MI6 to overthrow the Prime Minister and essentially put Mohammad Reza Shah, give him kind of ultimate control?
Yeah, in brief, what we have to say is that what used to be the Anglo-Persian oil company, which became the Anglo-Iranian oil company in 1934, has a monopoly. It's like the tobacco thing from 1891. And it's sustaining the British Empire. It is rather like Apple today. It is making the most profits in the world. So it's a fantastic sort of enterprise for the British. But Mohammad Mosaddegh, he comes to power as the Prime Minister under the Shah. And he says, look, we're going to nationalise this. Yeah. And initially, the Americans say, yeah, we'll go along with that because we're not keen on empires and Britain's imperial pretensions. And under Truman, they let it go ahead. Yeah. They don't think that's a problem. And of course, the British are not very happy with that because they nationalise the oil. It takes away huge amounts of income. It is partly responsible for the decline of the British Empire through the 50s and into the 60s. There's no question about that. But the bottom line is a coup is organised by MI6 and also by the CIA because Eisenhower comes into power. And given the relationship with the Soviet Union at the time and everything else that's going on, the Eisenhower administration decides, actually, we need to get some control over this. So if anybody's going to monopolise it in Iran, it's going to be our man, the Shah. Yeah. It's not going to be a democratically elected government. So the coup takes place. Initially, it's a failure. And the Shah himself actually says, I'm out of here, and actually departs. When the coup is successful on the second attempt, he comes back again. And he is then installed as basically the monopolistic partner with the Americans and the British in exploiting the oil and increasingly the gas reserves in Iran.
And are they thinking, the British and the Americans here, one thing we'll get through to the revolution is that it was kind of unique in the way that it brought such a broad church, a broad coalition together. Are they concerned with the Prime Minister in 1953 that he's already kind of bringing that coalition together? They want to put the Shah back in and get that monopoly that you talk about?
Yeah, I mean, in 1953, it is all about how we control this. Yeah. And what you see is a flood of British, as we heard earlier, we had Germans before, you have a flood of British, but more importantly, Americans coming in and obviously sitting on the ground in Iran. I think it's up to 50,000 Americans, for example, are there. Something like 20,000 British workers and others, but also they import guest workers from the countries around as well. So that causes a bit of unrest and a bit of a problem for the local population. The key point, Fergus, though, is just as before with the British monopolising the oil, now with the Shah monopolising the oil, not a lot of the money is seen to be flowing down to the people. Yeah. It's held very much amongst the elites at this stage. And you know, with a 40% stake in the company, Britain and America are still coining it.
Yeah. Well, Siavush, let's pick up the story there, because from there onwards and into the 1960s, the Shah implements what is now known as the White Revolution. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, yes. Well, the Shah has full control over the state system from the late 50s onwards. Builds Iran's first structured secret police, Savak, by 57 or 58. And of course, into the early 60s, one key thing is looking at the rise of radicalism across the Middle East, and particularly the very bloody way in which the Hashemite monarchy was deposed in Iraq in July of 1958. So in order also to stem such a scenario in Iran, he engages in reforms. One key reform that he engages in, which is the cornerstone of the White Revolution, is land reform. Iran had a very complex land tenure system, which wasn't quite European feudalism, but it was an archaic sort of structure of absentee landlords. And the Shah goes around effectively dispossessing them or forcing them to sell up at very low rates, and then assigning this land to the peasants who were working on them. And what follows is an extended process of the Shah showing up in the countryside, these very theatrical land deed ceremonies, a referendum and even a peasant congress to confirm all of this. And the second element of the White Revolution was extending suffrage to women, which proceeds in a far more at a far more lower pace. So this was a way in which the Shah sought to really consolidate his rule, and this expansion of the state worries the clergy. The clergy remains the only major social element opposed to the Shah, which was left standing after the political repression following the August 53 coup. And the White Revolution is the background which sets into motion clerical opposition to the Shah, particularly after the death of the senior Ayatollah Bourjadi, who was refraining from confronting the Shah directly, and that sets the stage for the rise to prominence of Ayatollah Khomeini through
it leads to his
two
exile,
separate
is that
initiatives
right?
he takes against the Shah in 63 and 64.
Yeah, and of course it leads to his exile.
First, initially in the June of 63, he gives an incendiary speech against the Shah, which leads to his arrest. He is sent into exile in the autumn of 64 after a second initiative against the Shah, where he expresses opposition to the extension of the Vienna Convention to American contractors working for the Iranian government rather than working for, say, the US Embassy or the American government in Iran. And by the end of 64, Khomeini is very prominent, but is also exiled to Turkey, and then he goes to Iraq.
Something I'm keen to explore just before we get into 78 and 79, Chris. I often see kind of these archival footage of Iran before 1979, whether it's pictures or video, and they kind of paint this sort of cosmopolitan picture. But as Siavush just said there, you know, this was still kind of a repressive regime under the Shah.
Yeah, I mean, I went to Iran with the Navy in the 1970s before the Shah's regime came to an end. I went to Bandar Abbas, and it was developing, as you might expect, a modern sort of post-war society. And quite a lot of what I saw in Iran at the time was like it was in Beirut. It was like a developing Western country in social terms. But I think one of the things that did strike me at the time, it was the pace of change. And it would be unsettling for any society to see a pace of change that rapidly secularized. That was the first thing. But the Shah himself did some extraordinary things. I mean, he recognized Israel. So that was something that was always
you can't remember. That's unimaginable today.
No, you can't. Also, he decided to change the dating system for Iran. That before had the Islamic dating system, of course, which we're familiar with today. But he said, we're going to start actually sort of calibrating dates from the reign of Cyrus the Great. So he added nearly 1,000 years to the calendar. So radical things like that, demonstrations of change, I think probably in a traditional society at the same time as Siavush was saying, you know, this land reform not only affected what the Shah was trying to do is get a sort of support mechanism for you know, the lower classes. But what he did was cut across quite a lot of sheer cleric ownership as well. So it's like dispossessing the monasteries in Henry VIII's reign and saying, look, the church can't have this land anymore. Similarly, the Shia clerics were deprived of land at the same time. So it became a big deal across both the religious and the social areas. And I have to say, part of the problem with the Shah is when a decision had to be made, he always seemed to make the wrong one. And you're wondering who's giving him advice at this stage. And so gauging what's going on, and of course, the answer to it was, as Siavush was saying, is you've got SAVAK, this heavily repressive organisation. It isn't trained in any way in doing riot control or the usual sort of control mechanisms. So it's heavily repressive, heavy-handed, and there are outrageous examples of human rights abuses. And what adds to the problem as you get up towards 78, 79 is the Carter administration is saying, we don't like how you repress your people. And that again is to sort of a poor decision in terms of losing control, giving concessions, and of course we all know totalitarian regimes, once they start to weaken, they go pretty quickly.
Well, we are, in just 1 second, going to move on to 1978-79. Just one more question for you, Siavush. So often in history, and now economies are so important, is kind of the final straw in the 70s, after the oil boom, inflation sort of reaches 20-25% in Iran?
Yes, of course. That was one consequence of the massive influx of liquidity which emerges from the 1973 oil shock following the Yom Kippur War. That was a moment in which Iran took part in this massive price hike engineered by OPEC, which led to a very severe energy crisis in the West. And suddenly there was an influx of liquidity, and Iran quite didn't know what to make with it. One aspect was inflation, of course. The other was, for example, as your guest mentioned, Bandar Abbas became an import port which couldn't handle all the massive imports that Iran, which of course was not under sanctions at the time, had extensive trade links with the world. Goods were simply rotting in the countryside outside Bandar Abbas because there was no onward transport that could take them all to Tehran and elsewhere. So there were massive infrastructure issues which came with this massive rise in liquidity, and of course inflation. And for much of the 70s, the strategy of the Shah was that of blaming price gouging by, for example, shopkeepers and more, instead of acting at the macroeconomic level and solve this issue with inflation. However, that in isolation was not really the sort of economic crisis that we see in later decades. For example, we see in the present day. So it was an economic shock, but I don't think it was enough per se to really bring about a revolution.
Perhaps not enough on its own, but all factors creating an environment that could breed a revolution. That is some of the background history on Iran. Now let's talk about the events of 1978 and 79 itself. OK, let's talk about the Iranian Revolution itself now. And this takes place during just over a year between 1978 and 79. Chris, how do we get to the start of revolution?
So we've painted a picture where you've got heavy-handed control by the Shah's regime. You've got a lot of festering resentment at every level of society. And what I'd like to stress about this revolution is it's atypical. It's quite unlike any other revolution where you normally have class against class, or you have a failed war or something like that. This is quite incredible. You get a build-up towards 1978, everybody from the merchant class, the Bazari as they're known as, saying, look, we've had all this dislocation in internal trade, as Siavush mentioned earlier on. We've got inflation. We had high expectations with the high oil prices from 1973. 78, 79, we've got a real crash, really, from about 1977. You then have a series of triggers, which then build on this simmering unrest that's occurring at every level of society. First thing is, the Shah makes an agreement with Iraq saying, look, it's called the Algiers Accord. We want you to get rid of Khomeini. And Khomeini goes to Paris. So he actually takes himself out of the environment. He's seen as a sort of hero that's gone into exile. There's also a pervasive ideology going around that the Shah is the reincarnation of Yazid, who is the king, the tyrant king, whom Hussein, the hero of Shia Islam, opposes. And this is really prevalent on the ground. You then get a situation where you have a big fire in Abadan.
In a cinema?
In a cinema.
Yeah. And Abadan is sort of, it's kind of on the border, sort of down here, isn't it?
Yeah. And you get a situation where people are locked into the cinema. Nearly 400 people die. Now, everybody blames it on Savak. And you get to see a series of strikes and demonstrations in real mass numbers in a lot of these cities. And it's this passive resistance that is generated. And what we have to understand is, in the days before the internet, the Shia cleric network is very powerful. And so you have cassettes being passed around with sermons on, you have sort of meetings, all sorts of shadow groups. And again, we have to understand that Islam traditionally has been the way in which historically totalitarian and authoritarian regimes are opposed. So if you look at any revolt in history in this region, totalitarian regimes are opposed through the medium of Islam, and this is what is happening here. So you have the fire in Abadan. That's blamed on Savak. It probably wasn't Savak. It was probably Islamists, in fact, that caused it. You then have a demonstration in Tehran called Black Friday, where you get a huge repressive effect. People don't know how to deal with it. It sort of builds towards the end of the year. You're getting more and more strikes and demonstrations, and then martial law is proclaimed. And that's a good point, I think, probably to hand over to Siavush.
Yeah, Siavush, can you pick it up there after martial law is declared? I just wanted to ask you about that cinema fire. Chris obviously raised that. Do we know who set it? Obviously, Savak was blamed at the time, but it's kind of been revised a little bit over history ever since.
Yes, just one point. The Al-Juzda court were in 1975. Khomeini is expelled from Iraq in October of 78. The Al-Juzda courts were slightly different. It was about ending the Iranian support for the Kurdish Iraqi insurgency, and also had an item related to the Shatt al-Arab and territorial waters there. So the Cinema Rex fire was, we now know, a freelance initiative by a group of lower sort of ranking, ordinary, I would say, supporters of the opposition and Khomeini in Abadan. They don't seem to have had any particular coordination with the leadership of the opposition. The initial impression of the victims, and the reason why this fire was so widespread and led to so many deaths, something like 400, was that this was a wooden structure, and of course it was full of cinema film, which is highly inflammable, and the whole thing went up in flames very quickly. And the doors were locked because of a spate of attacks against cinemas nationwide. The initial reaction of the relatives was that they knew that this was done by religious activists, and they gathered outside Abadan City Council the following day, claiming that they would seek revenge against mosques in particular. However, Khomeini very ably managed to win the sort of propaganda war around the Cinema Rex, and came out with a statement saying to the effect that Muslims would never perform such a heinous act, and that had an impact. And everybody started to claim that the Cinema Rex incident was something staged by the authorities, and the authorities simply did not have the ability to turn this around. And this was, as you said, in a very analog era. You couldn't do it through memes and AI and whatever else you can make use of today.
Like we're seeing,
and this was a very key element in the Shah's establishment's inability to really convince people that it wasn't keen on performing mass murder.
And it really is remarkable how kind of quickly it spiraled, because you get this martial law, the military begins to defect, and then by January 1979, the Shah flees Iran.
Yeah, again, we're going back to 1953 here. The Shah is remarkably light-footed. As soon as there's any trouble, he's out of there. And he goes on holiday, as he says, to Egypt, who's a close ally with Anwar Sadat, and he stays there. Yeah. It's as simple as that. Then you have the return of the Ayatollah Khomeini from Paris, famously. And I think the critical thing at this stage is the military says, we're staying neutral in this.
Indeed.
Quite extraordinary. And I think it's a critical issue. If you look at Iran today, if you have control of the security services, you have control of the population. Yeah. And so there was a complete collapse in morale, if you like, in terms of allegiance, mainly because the Shah had fled, of course. There's no point of allegiance at all. You then get a situation where, as I said, Ayatollah Khomeini returns. You then have essentially almost a civil war going on between the person who's been left behind as the Prime Minister, a chap called Bakhtiar by the Shah, and somebody who, and Ayatollah Khomeini says, well, I'm going to do the appointing, if anybody is, and he appoints a chap called Bazagan. And you then have a fairly serious civil war going on in many cities around Iran at this stage. I mean, there's a notorious incident where guerrillas who are representing Islamist groups and Marxist groups break into a factory which has 50,000 machine guns in it. And these are distributed amongst the people. And you've got very serious killing going on at this stage before any sort of order is restored. You then have a referendum about, what sort of government do we want to have in March. They decide they want to have, a regime under Khomeini and so forth. And it goes forward. And by the end of the year, they move to a fully Islamic guardianship, as they call it. And this is something that Khomeini has pushed all the way through his time abroad. He said, you need the guardianship of the people by the jurist class. Now, this means control by the Ayatollahs. Of course. And it's a sort of way of balancing totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and theocracy.
Yeah. And it's a system which pretty much, Siavush, has held until today. What are those kind of early years after 1979 like in Iran?
Well, first of all, the system as we see it now requires some time to consolidate and establish a monopolistic grip over the political scene of society. From 79 through to the June of 1981, when the first president, Abu Hassan Bani Saad, who fell foul of Khomeini's closest associates, is impeached and dismissed and goes underground. In that 2.5 years, we have a lot going on. We have, of course, the takeover of the US Embassy in November of 79, the start of the Iran-Iraq War, September 1980. And we have a lot of other political movements on the scene. Yeah. Many non-Khomeinist formations that took part in the revolution, for example, Mossadegh supporters in the National Front, various shades of the Iranian left, the pro-communist, pro-Moscow Tudeh party, communist, and the Fada'i guerrillas, Maoists, and so on and so forth. They all are progressively ousted from the political scene through heavy means and not through sort of democratic process, I would say. Parliamentary elections do not really result in political minorities being given seats in parliament. And the press is progressively muzzled and repressed from the summer of 1979 onwards. So it wasn't simply a smooth transition into monopolistic power. And those 2.5 years were crisis-ridden, and they featured domestic crisis and internal crisis. And it took a while for the Khomeinist faction to really consolidate the way it did. There were misgivings, particularly in peripheral regions such as Kurdistan in particular, over the extent of the rule of central authorities and of this new Islamic Republic. So it wasn't a smooth process at all, and it was a very crisis-ridden.
Absolutely, it wasn't a smooth process. And before we move on to the counterfactuals, the one thing we do have to discuss is the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, which completely shapes where we are today.
The time we're talking about, Iran, of course, is attacked by Iraq. And Saddam Hussein decides that it's an opportunity, really, to consolidate gains. We talked about the Shatt al-Arab waterway earlier on. Yeah. And that Algiers Accord completely breaks down, and you have this massive war between Iraq and Iran, ballistic missiles flying in both directions. It totally sets back Iran in terms of its development and consolidates, of course, the regime in power. Quite a lot of the repressive measures that Siavush just mentioned were brought in on the back of, we're in a national emergency situation. We've got traitors in our midst, both in terms of confessional traitors, but also political traitors as well. So we need to really screw down on this. I mean, it's quite interesting. If you look at the Iranian embassy siege with the Americans, I had a journalist friend at the time who said, I witnessed what happened at the American embassy. He said they also went round the Soviet embassy as well and tried to do the same. And the Soviet ambassador came out onto the veranda and said, in perfect Farsi, quite understand you're a revolutionary, ambitions here. But you must understand, if you continue with this, in 1 hour's time, your country will cease to exist. And they all decided it was better to go back to the American embassy. And that shows you about perceptions of power. You've got this adjacent superpower. Yes. You've got this distant one. We'll go back and create the great Satan here in our minds.
We'll hold those thoughts, because I think when it comes to the Soviet Union, we might be talking about them slightly more in our next section, because that, of course, is the real history of what happened during the Iranian Revolution. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, it's time to get into what we love doing here on History Undone and ask ourselves some of those really long-term questions had the Iranian Revolution not happened. Starting with Chris, I think, what are the... is it possible that the Shah's reign could have held? What are the what's the environment that might have seen that happen?
Yeah, I think there are two issues. One is the fact he fled to Egypt. He basically removed himself and all the authority and all the majesty associated with that. What we have to remember, though, of course, it's a very young dynasty. It's only been there since 1921. He's only the second member of it. So
it is, but the monarchy has been there for thousands of years.
And also there is this deference to it, and also it's an important junction box for all sorts of other things as well. So I think if he hadn't fled, if he had actually stayed there, the second thing, which I think is absolutely critical, is the military decides to remain neutral at that point. I think had the military held, that would have been a power base within the country with which somebody would have had to have negotiated. That's the point. It would also have formed a focus for all these other groups that Siavush mentioned, you know, the constitutionalists, the ex-Mosaddegh people and things like that, to say, hang on, we're not too keen on this Islamism that's advancing itself now. And what we have to realise is that Khomeini and the Shia activists here were very much like the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution. They were the most active element. They were the most visible element. They propagandized. They created networks in the same way, and thus were very powerful. The only force that could have opposed that was the armed forces, with its not only its footprint across the country, but also its military power, to tell the truth.
Do you agree, Siavush, or do you think, with kind of the demographics and the ethnicity and everything we've seen in Iran, do you think some sort of revolution or some sort of change was always going to happen?
Well, first of all, we have to bear in mind that the Shah was sick by the end of the 70s. He had been suffering from cancer. He died of cancer in the summer of 1980. Maybe that was due, of course, an accelerated process due to, of course, the exile and how he had to move around like a Flying Dutchman after leaving Iran. But even assuming that he had stayed in Iran with the best of care, he probably wouldn't have lasted more than a few years. So there would have been the Crown Prince, Reza Pahlavi, who is, of course, quite famous today, rising to the throne by the mid-80s and facing a lot of challenges, of course. There would have been ethnic challenges. The population would have been restive. The process of alienation of the Pahlavi state from society would have continued into the 1980s. An iron fist would have been necessary in very much in the same way in which we saw iron fist being applied in later decades under the Islamic Republic. So it wouldn't have been a smooth transition unless, of course, the Crown Prince would have found a way to actually democratize the system and to inject the pluralism that was missing entirely from his father's rule until 1979. But other things would have been also interesting. For example, Iran's civil aviation was really on the up by the late 70s. And you could have had a situation in which Tehran airport would have played the role of, say, Istanbul airport or Dubai or Doha airport today. It would have been a far more congenial hub geographically for flights going into Southeast Asia had Iran Air been able to develop like Emirates or Turkish Airlines or Qatar Airways did. So there could have been developments beyond the political into the economic, because, of course, Iran was never subject to the sanctions and isolation that we have seen under the Islamic Republic from the 80s onwards.
That's a really, really interesting point. So something as simple as that, the airport, like Siavush just said, that could kind of change Iran standing on the
Yeah, I mean,
stage?
I remember from the time how incredibly talented everybody from Iran seemed, to tell you the truth. Everybody I met had great ideas for taking things forwards. It's a country of merchants and entrepreneurs. And if Iran is to come out into the world again as we know it, we're going to see an enormous amount of energy released in that sense. And geographically, Siavush is right. It could have displaced, well, it could have been a predecessor for what is happening in Dubai now, or indeed Qatar.
Yeah.
And that's quite important. I think the key issues that we need to consider here is that if the Shah had died earlier and the Crown Prince had taken over, you've got a different dynamic, you've got a youngster coming in. They're going to think, well, the Shah was young once. Remember how that happened. So I honestly think that it actually hinged on the activism, as I said, of the Shia networks to actually get in there and make the revolution happen.
You mentioned it a little bit earlier, Siavush, the Shah's cancer that he hides. It's it's one of those stories that comes up all the time when you're researching this. How important was that? Do you genuinely think if he hadn't had that cancer, things might have been incredibly different?
Maybe not, but one of the reasons why the revolution did succeed was that the Shah progressively lost resolve.
Sure.
And he was, for example, very dispirited by seeing the very large crowds after the November and December protests when he was still in Tehran. And that led him to, as he put it, go abroad for a period of rest, as it happened in January 79. So he didn't choose to tough it down and left. Maybe a more healthy Shah, given that we are talking of counterfactuals, would not have left the country in January 79. He wasn't on the verge of being deposed by street unrest. He still had, for example, control over his royal palace. There still wasn't a popular uprising that threatened him physically, despite the fact that there were widespread strikes, there were massive demonstrations. He chose to left of his own volition, despite the fact that some people within his entourage were begging him not to do so. So maybe a healthy and a more sort of robust thinking Shah would not have left. That would have maybe persuaded the army to crack down, or persuade him to appoint tougher military governors. The last senior military officials also appointed by the Shah were relatively meeker, particularly the military prime minister before Bakhtiyar, Ashari. So I think his state of mind and his physical state probably had an impact on the decision-making in the last weeks and months, which in turn, of course, aided the revolution in a major manner.
I think there's a couple of other things, Fergus, here. I mean, it's on record that actually his doctors didn't tell him about his cancer for about 2 or 3 years. So it could have actually possibly been addressed, even though it was pretty severe, obviously, by the end. The other thing is, if you look at the Shah's memoirs, he says, I was convinced that the British and the Americans wanted me out anyway. He actually says that it's a conspiracy against me. They didn't want me anymore
Because he wasn't reliable and he kept fleeing. I mean,
well, I think because he was unreliable. If you look at all his decision making, I mean, we said earlier, every time he has to make a decision, he seems to make the wrong one. He prevaricates. He's very light on his feet when it's getting out of the country. Yeah. So you've got a very weak monarch here. Had he been replaced by his son? I think there are possibilities there, to tell you the truth.
OK, some of those possibilities, whether he's replaced by his son, whether he doesn't have cancer, the dynasty remains. If we sort of work our way out, we discussed the Iran-Iraq war earlier in the 80s. Does that still happen?
Possibly. It depends on Saddam Hussein's agenda. I suspect, though, that with the Shah in place, the Americans are going to massively reinforce with arms supplies Iran, so you might not want to take it on. The real issue, Fergus, of course, is the regime has recognised the State of Israel. So the whole dynamic in relation to Israel changes overnight. We don't have that tension, that issue that you've had with the Islamic regime and Israel since. There's no doubt that...
Is that something that can hold?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And remember, at the time, the Sunni countries are very hostile to Israel. You've had a situation where Egypt, of course, has been involved in an invasion in 1973. Syria is hostile. You've got all sorts of things going on around. Lebanon probably isn't destabilised to the extent that it is after the Islamic Revolution in 1979. So the whole dynamic here changes. But what we mustn't think is that Iran is going to be a shrinking violet.
No.
Under the Shah, it was always seeking to be the regional superpower. And that's obviously in opposition to Saudi Arabia and also to Turkey. And a real indication of that is the Iranians were getting the sort of ships that were going to enable them to dominate not just the Gulf, but warships that could go down into the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, typified by some destroyers called the Kidd class, which they got hold of. Well, they didn't get hold of in the end because of the revolution, but they basically had ordered. So the ambition is to be the regional superpower. And of course, that suits the Americans because you've got the Soviet Union in the north, and it holds the balance of power. And what you see, even in 1971, is Iran saying, as the British leave, we're going to take some islands here in the Gulf. They've still got them.
Islands that are very important right now.
Yeah, the Great and Lesser Tombah and Abu Musa, so they take hold of those. And they also say, we've got ambitions on Bahrain, which in fact they give up subsequently and say, we're not going to do that. But you've got to bear in mind there's a big Shia and first and second generation Iranian population there at this time. Shias in Yemen, a regime in Syria that is Alawite, which is basically a Shia derivative. And so you've got this diaspora, if you like, this network of agents, if you like, around here. But they will be developed in a totally different way to the axis of resistance that we have seen grow up under the Islamic Republic.
Do you agree with that assessment, Siavush? And how does a Middle East in that scenario kind of work together cohesively?
Well, the relationship between the Shah's regime and these Shia communities was at times going in the direction of what the Islamic Republic would do. At times it wasn't. For example, it did cultivate a good relationship with the Lebanese Shia, but didn't really coalesce and build an organization like Hezbollah within them. With regards to Yemen, Yemen was, of course, divided. There was a Marxist regime going on there as well. Iran had poured a lot of resources into propping up the Sultanate of Oman in the Jafar rebellion, and the Shah sent a considerable amount of. So, in terms of the extent to which all of this would have resulted in the creation of a regional pro-Shia sort of alliance in the Middle East along the lines of, or inspired in, or similar in some way to the axis of resistance we will see in later decades, really is debatable. Also because, of course, the Shah certainly had a rivalry with Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern states, also with Iraq, at least until 1975, but had a very different approach towards the West, of course, and wasn't creating organizations which would antagonize Western interests in a major manner, like, of course, the Islamic Republic did. So I think the Shah would not have turned against Western interests, particularly after the Camp David Accords and the rapprochement between Israel and other Arab states, particularly Jordan, which of course culminated with the Jordan-Israel peace accord.
Let me be clear. I'm not saying we'd have got a Shia sort of network around here. What I'm saying is you've got a wider Iranian way of actually keeping Saudi Arabia in check. And what's going to be really interesting in this scenario, where you have a modernizing Iran and, of course, a very regressive Saudi Arabia at this time. So you've not only got Sunni Shia confessional strife here, you've also got modernism against probably traditionalism here. And on the other side, of course, you've got Egypt, which is an ally of the Shah. That continues. And you see, really, the Americans, the British, and everybody else saying, look, Iran is not just a bulwark against the Soviet Union, it is a massive stabilizing element here, as long as we can contain the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And you know, the Americans actually came up with a strategy. They called it a twin pillar strategy.
Yes.
That we'll have here. And that leaves the Gulf states sandwiched between the two. So you think to yourself, where is their allegiance going to go in all this? Now the British have departed. The Americans are going to take a very keen interest in this area, but only for so long. Because if it's stable, they're not worried. And if Iran becomes their local gendarme, as they call it,
yes,
then you've got a very stabilised Middle East, as I said, with Iran possibly influencing foreign policy on its own behalf and not in opposition, but in parallel with Saudi Arabia.
So those Western and in particular American interests, then how does that bring us up to the 21st century? Because from 2000 onwards, I mean, yeah, where are we in this time?
Well, I think the critical thing here, Fergus, of course, is Iran, if it doesn't become the Islamic Republic, doesn't have its close relationship with China. So China doesn't get massive amounts of oil and gas, which it has done for the last 30 years. It doesn't have trade going back into Iran the way it does now. And the whole dynamic of superpower politics at the end of the Cold War starts to look very different indeed. If Iran is Western aligned and stays that way, China's going to have to go somewhere else for its oil and gas as it starts to pick up on its economy. And indeed, what we're seeing today, of course, is the Straits of Hormuz is something that China's very interested in, as well as the rest of us, to tell you the truth. And as long as China is guaranteed its supplies through the Straits, it doesn't really mind what regime is in Tehran, to tell you the truth.
Do you agree with that, Siavush? Obviously, we're unravelling a lot of history, but in 2026, that relationship between Iran and China and the current closure of the Strait of Hormuz, are we seeing that in this timeline?
Well, Iran and China had good relations even before the revolution. The Chinese leader, Hua Guofeng, controversially was the last major foreign leader to visit the Shah in the thick of the revolution. And that earned a very sharp rebuke from Ayatollah Khomeini, who was in exile at the time. It is likely that there would have been the continuation of tensions over the Persian Gulf had the Shah remained in power. And he would have certainly tried to assert himself as the main sort of force, military force, policeman of the Gulf, as he was named by some after the British retreat in 1971. That strategy would have probably continued. And the strategy of tension with the Arab world would have continued, particularly because, of course, the Middle East is a bit of a tight area of the world, and there's not enough space for sort of for many self-aggrandizing tyrants and autocrats. And when you have Saddam Hussein in Iraq, the Shah in Iran, Saudi Arabian monarch or more, it starts to feel like there's a lack of space, if you want, and it gets quite tight. And sort of these tensions would have carried on, despite the fact that, as I said, Iran would have continued to have a very different relationship with the West, would have continued to be a part of sort of broadly aligned to the West when it came to military pacts, military assistance, receiving military equipment from the United States in particular. And it would have been very interesting to see what would have happened to Iran had the Shah survived past the end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union, I just want to discuss that. Does this at all change the invasion of Afghanistan?
Well, of course, it happens, alongside it, and Iran is involved in what is going on in Afghanistan. What I think going on from what Siavush was saying just then is really interesting here. And picking up on the civil aviation issue, knowing the Iranian people, had the Shah remained in power, the Americans are not as interested in this area anymore. If they've got two pillars stabilizing this region. Israel is
massive
safe.
Pillars as well.
Yeah. So Iran is saying, well, actually, you know what? I can actually balance between the West and the East here. And as China comes more and more onto the world stage in the wake of the Cold War, they're saying, look, we sit between there. We can benefit in both directions here. And there is absolutely no question that with the talent available and all the resources available, they had that open to them to be able to say, well, actually, we're going to break free of traditional structures, sit here in the Middle East, and we're going to go in both directions. Now, in terms of the Soviet Union, of course, with Iran actually producing more and more oil, it also offsets what's coming out of the Soviet Union. So as the Soviet Union transitions into Russia, its own oil production and markets start to diminish in relation to Iran and Saudi Arabia. So if you're the Soviet Union, towards the end of the Cold War, you're thinking, I might need to take a bit of interest down here in the Caucasus. And maybe even push on to Iran and say, look, you know, we want a share of this as well. So what you could have had, instead of the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union hanging on and saying, we need to face south now, as Russia has always done, and get involved here.
Never underestimate the Soviet Union. Have they got the resources to do that?
Yeah, they have. They've got the military resources, and of course they've got, you know, an authoritarian power to be able to bear down. And certainly it's going to drag the Americans back in again, that's for sure. But you know, if you've got a declining Soviet Union, which has got its major oil market, let's just see what's happened in the Black Sea today and the Eastern Mediterranean, where Russia's markets have been threatened by competitors. They've intervened militarily in Ukraine, and they've also obviously tried to get involved in Syria. And as Putin said, if if we're not at the table, we'll be on the menu.
Just before we bring this to a close, Siavush, this version of Iran that we just talked about, with kind of a more US interest, are the US more willing to let Iran have nuclear weapons?
Well, it would have required then as now for Iran to leave the NPT, because Iran acceded to the NPT by the late 60s, early 70s, during the Shah's time, with a key confidant of the Shah actually signing it. So Iran would have had to exit it and then move towards developing a weapon. Every now and then the Shah floated this idea in press interviews during the 1970s. It would have needed to be seen whether Iran would really feel a need for it. A lot would have depended if, for example, Iran would have really entered into a conflict with Iraq, such a long conflict, 1980 to 88, had the Shah remained in power. Remember, the conflict started in September 1980 because Saddam effectively tore up those Algiers Accords that we mentioned earlier and said that under the new regime, they were no longer valid or useful strategically for Iraq. Would that have happened if the Shah would still be in power? Perhaps not. That might have lessened the need to go for a nuclear weapon, but the Shah would probably have carried on the nuclear program along the lines of what the Islamic Republic did, because the Islamic Republic at some point had to weigh up over whether to continue the Shah's nuclear program or not, and it did, of course. That was basically a leftover from the Shah's period, and it decided that rather than dismantling it, it would have continued it, and the Shah would have probably done the same.
Final thought from you on this, Chris. I guess to sum up, we're still talking about this today. It's in the news. I'm sure our audience are aware. Where are we on balance today in this alternative timeline?
Well, this alternative timeline, you've got a regional superpower that's jockeying for position, probably with Saudi Arabia as well. I mean, just going back to the nuclear issue, it may have been what stimulated a nuclear capability would have been the threat from the North.
Indeed,
oddly enough, is that actually we need to counter the Soviet Union, or Russia as it became. And of course, if Iran had developed a nuclear weapon, you can bet Saudi Arabia would have got one as well. So the non-proliferation treaty is looking very ragged. So you're going to end up with quite a few nuclear powers here: Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, maybe. The whole nuclear profile looks very different if they went for that. But I don't think they would have done that. They've got extended deterrence, I think, from the United States. But what really should strike us is how successful Iran probably would be now if it hadn't had the revolution in 1979.
Absolutely fascinating. So we are sort of staying much closer ties to the US, perhaps two sort of great powers here in Saudi Arabia and Iran, a very different Middle East, possible Soviet Union invasion of Iran, and also perhaps a more nuclear Middle East. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for today. My thanks to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and Dr. Siavush Randjbar-Daemi for joining me. We'll be back undoing more history very soon. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. And you can also listen and follow the show as a podcast. Just search for History Undone in your podcast apps, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.